I'll write the hook and part 1 now, following all production standards and the character framework you've provided. Hook 90-110 words. My heart is already promised. Those were the words Evelyn Hartwell spoke the morning her life cracked clean in two. She had a fiancé in Denver, a family name worth protecting, and a future already written by hands that were not her own. Then a quiet cowboy with dust on his boots and no land to his name looked at her like she was worth more than all of it combined. She did not expect that. She did not want it, and she could not stop it. If you have ever felt your own life happening without you, stay right here. Subscribe and let's ride. Part 1: The promise she never made to herself. The letter arrived on a Tuesday. The way most unwanted things do. Evelyn Hartwell read it twice at the breakfast table in Denver, her coffee going cold beside her, and when she finished, she set it down with both hands flat on the linen cloth, as if steadying herself against a current she could already feel pulling. Her father, Gerald Hartwell, read the same letter across from her and said nothing for a long moment. Then the Colorado property needs a proper assessment before the autumn contracts close. I'd like you to represent the family. Evelyn folded the letter along its original crease. You want me to go to the ranch. I want you to see it. Assess it. Come back and tell me whether it's worth expanding the herd. I've never assessed a cattle operation. You've been watching me run one for 27 years. That was her father's way of saying yes. You're capable, without ever saying I believe in you. Evelyn understood the difference. She had been understanding that difference most of her life. She looked out the window toward the street, where a delivery cart was making slow work of the cobblestones. Denver was full of carts and contracts and men making deals that would shape other people's tomorrows. She had grown up in the middle of all of it, had learned its rhythms the way you learn, the sound of a house settling at night, familiar enough that you stop noticing it, even when it keeps you awake. Charles will have opinions about me traveling alone, she said. Gerald waved one hand, dismissing this. Charles Whitmore has opinions about everything. That's why his company runs on time. Tell him it's family business. He'll understand family business. She was not certain Charles would understand. But she nodded, because nodding was usually the right response in her father's house. Charles did not understand. He came to dinner that evening, looking polished and certain in the way he always looked. And when she explained the plan, he set down his fork with the deliberate care of a man who wanted to appear reasonable while feeling the opposite. Colorado, he repeated, the Hartwell property outside of Glenwood Springs. My father needs an assessment. Your father has an accountant. He wants family eyes on it. He trusts my judgment. Charles turned his wineglass a quarter turn. Your judgment is not the question, Evelyn. A single woman traveling to a working cattle property without proper escort is a question of propriety. My father's ranch manager will be present, a hired man, an experienced ranch manager. That is not the same as proper company. She kept her voice level. She had practice at that. My father asked me to go. Charles, it is his property and my family's business, and in less than 4 months it will be our family's business. He said it pleasantly, the way a man states something he considers settled. I'd prefer you wait until after the wedding. The autumn contracts won't wait until after the wedding. There was a silence between them that was not entirely comfortable, which was unusual. Charles Whitmore was a man who engineered comfort the way other men engineered bridges deliberately. Load by load, bolt by bolt, he engineered it in his offices. He engineered it at dinner tables. He had engineered it throughout their courtship, which had been proper and patient and correct in every particular. Evelyn had found it reassuring once. 3 weeks, she said. I'll be back before September is out. He studied her with those steady gray eyes that she had always thought looked like certainty itself. You'll write, every few days, and you'll take the family carriage, not the stage. She agreed to this because it cost her nothing and mattered to him. And because picking careful battles was something she had learned long before Charles Whitmore came into her life. She left for Colorado on a Monday morning with her traveling trunk, her father's letter of introduction, and a feeling she could not quite name, something that sat between relief and guilt, which might have been the most honest description of her life she had managed in some time. The ranch was 3 days' journey from Denver, through country that grew quieter, the farther you went from the city. until the silence was so complete it had texture to it. She had not expected that. She had not expected the way the Colorado sky opened up past the foothills. Enormous and indifferent, and somehow easier to breathe under than any sky she had known. She had not expected the way the land stopped apologizing for itself, no groomed hedges, no careful fences, nothing prettied up for the sake of a visitor's comfort. Just ground and grass, and the sound of wind moving through both. The ranch manager, a stout red-faced man named Porter, met the carriage at the gate and spent the better part of an hour showing her the books and the condition of the outbuildings, talking faster than she needed and explaining things she had not asked about, as men in his position often did when confronted with a woman who held authority over them and had not yet established what kind of authority that would be. She let him talk. She asked precise questions. She wrote things in her notebook in a hand that was smaller and neater than people expected from someone who had grown up as comfortably as she had. And she was still writing when the sound of hooves came into the yard. There were 3 of them cowboys, returning from what Porter said was the eastern fence line. 2 riding ahead and 1 behind, the rear man moving at a pace slightly apart from the others, as if he were following his own internal schedule. Porter shaded his eyes. That's Everhart and 2 of his boys. Good hands. Everhart especially. The 2 riders in front dismounted, with the easy habit of men who had done it 10,000 times. The one who came last took a moment longer, stepping down with the careful deliberateness of someone whose body had earned its right to be deliberate. He was tall. He was dark-haired, going just slightly toward gray at the temple. And he had the kind of face that showed everything it had been through, without making a performance of it, a face that had been in weather and not minded particularly. He did not look at her immediately. He handed his reins to one of the other men, said something quiet that made the other man nod, and then he did look one clear, level, unhurried look that assessed her, the way she had been assessing the fence lines in Porter's accounts. Without prejudice, without flattery, and without any apparent need to fill the space with words. She had been looked at her entire adult life. She was accustomed to it. Men looked at her with interest, or with calculation, or with the particular expression that meant they were deciding whether she was worth knowing. Women looked at her with estimation. Nobody had looked at her the way this man looked at her, which is to say, as if she were simply there, present and real. And that was enough to account for. Porter started in on introductions before she could decide what to make of that. Miss Hartwell, this is Samuel Everhart, best wrangler in the county, which he'll never tell you himself. The cowboy touched the brim of his hat. Miss Hartwell, that was all. No flourish, no performed courtesy. Just her name in a voice that was low and had gravel at the edges of it. And 2 words that nonetheless managed to convey that he knew she was Gerald Hartwell's daughter, that she held some authority here, and that he intended to give that authority its proper respect without performing enthusiasm about it. She said Mr. Everhart, and returned to her notebook. She was not certain, later, what she expected from the days that followed. She expected the work of assessment, the accounts, the herd counts, the condition of the property. She expected Porter's company, which was businesslike and not unpleasant. She had not expected Samuel Everhart. He was present in the way that useful things are present, always where the work required him, never where it didn't. He did not seek her out. He did not avoid her. If she asked a question about the herd, he answered it directly, without embellishment, and then returned to whatever he had been doing before the question interrupted him. On the 3rd day, she was watching from the fence rail as 2 younger hands attempted to move a particularly stubborn bull from one pen to the adjoining one, which was going badly for everyone involved, including the bull. And she heard a low sound beside her, not quite a word, not quite a laugh, and turned to find Everhart 2 feet away, watching the same scene with his arms folded on the top rail. They're pushing from the wrong side, she said. It came out before she had decided to say it. Yes, he agreed. Then you've worked cattle before. I watched my father work cattle. That's the same thing. Sometimes. She looked back at the pen. They need to let him think the other pen is his idea. Everhart unfolded his arms and said something to the younger men in a voice she couldn't quite catch from where she stood. The change in approach was immediate and subtle, less force, more suggestion, and 20 seconds later, the bull moved through the gate as if it had always intended to. "How did you know that?" she asked. "Know what? That they'd listen to you." He looked at her sideways. "They didn't listen to me. They listened to good sense." Lifted his hat an inch and resettled it. "Morning, Miss Hartwell," and he walked off down the fence line, leaving her to figure out whether she had just been complimented or corrected, and eventually concluding it might have been neither. The evenings on the ranch were nothing like evenings in Denver. In Denver, evenings had shape and schedule. There were dinners with conversation that moved along understood tracks, and after-dinner arrangements, and calls, and the general business of a life that was constantly accounting for itself in front of other people. Out here, the evenings simply arrived, unhurried, bringing the kind of quiet that had enough room in it to hear yourself think. Evelyn was not entirely comfortable with that kind of quiet. She had not been alone with her own thoughts in a very long time. She sat on the porch of the main house on the fourth evening with her notebook in her lap. Not writing, watching the light go out of the sky in colors that no one had thought to name. And she heard boots on the hard ground and looked up to find Everhart coming from the direction of the barn with his hat in his hand. He did not stop walking. He was clearly headed somewhere else. But he glanced up and saw her on the porch and said, "Evening, evening," she answered. He took another step and then stopped, which she had the impression he had not entirely planned. He stood there a moment with his hat turning slowly in one hand. "You all right out here?" "I'm perfectly fine. Porter said you hadn't come to supper." She had not been hungry. She had been thinking about Charles's last letter, which had arrived that afternoon, which had been pleasant and organized, and had felt, reading it out here in this particular silence, like a letter written by a careful stranger. "I'll eat later. There's food left, thank you." He nodded and started moving again. And she did not know why she said what she said next, except that the silence had been asking something of her all evening, and she had run out of patience for unanswered questions. "Do you like it out here, Mr. Everhart?" "The work, the country," he stopped again. "Yes, not the place you imagined for yourself?" A pause. "I grew up on a ranch. Small one, east of Pueblo. What happened to it?" The hat stopped turning. "Drought. Bad contracts. Same thing that happens to most small ranches eventually." He said it without particular weight, the way you describe a weather pattern rather than a loss. "My father sold what was left. I hired on with other men's herds. I'm sorry. Nothing to be sorry for. It's just the way things went." She looked at him steadily. "That's not the same thing as it not being a loss." Something shifted in his expression barely. Almost nothing, just a slight change in the quality of his attention. The way you notice when a room changes temperature before you can quite say why. "No," he said, "it's not the same thing." He put his hat back on. "Good night, Miss Hartwell." "Good night, Mr. Everhart." She watched him walk away and then looked back at the sky, which had finished its colors and gone to a deep clean dark full of stars. And she thought, "I am going to marry Charles Whitmore in 4 months and live in a Denver house and go to dinner parties and raise children who will go to dinner parties of their own. And that will be a perfectly good life. It will be exactly the life I agreed to." She wrote nothing in her notebook that night. Charles's next letter arrived 2 days later, and it was thorough and affectionate and organized, as all his letters were, and it mentioned that he had spoken to her father about the property and that he believed the best decision would be to sell it rather than expand it, because expansion required capital and time, and he had a plan for that capital that would serve them both better after the wedding. She read that letter standing at the writing desk in the study, and she read it 3 times. On the third reading, what struck her was not the opinion. It was the fact that he had formed it before she had finished her assessment. Before she had written a word of her report, he had already decided what was wise, had already spoken to her father about it, and neither of them had thought to wait and hear what she had found. She set the letter down. She picked up her notebook. She went back to the fence line and spent 2 more hours in the afternoon sun, asking Porter questions and writing the answers down, and her handwriting got smaller and neater the further she went, which was something that happened when she was being very careful. That evening, Everhart was mending fence wire at the far edge of the yard. She walked toward him because she needed to ask about the water situation on the east pasture, and he was the most reliable source of an honest answer, which was the only kind of answer she wanted today. He saw her coming and waited, which was a thing she had noticed about him. He did not pretend not to see people. And he did not perform busyness when someone was approaching. He simply stopped and waited. "The east pasture," she said. "How's the water been this summer? Dry July. Better August. Could it sustain an expanded herd?" He thought about this with the honest weight of someone who understood the actual consequences of his answer. "For a year, maybe. 2 if August stays better. You'd need another water source if you wanted to be certain. A well? Or redirect from the creek. Creek's reliable most years." "Most years." "Ma'am, this is Colorado. There's no certain in it." She wrote this in her notebook. Then she said, without fully intending to, "My father's already made his decision." Everhart did not respond immediately. He looked at the wire in his hands and then back at her. "Then why are you still asking questions? Because the answer might matter, even if no one's waiting for it." He looked at her for a moment with that level, unhurried quality she was starting to recognize as just the way he engaged with the world. No performance. No pretense, just direct attention. "That's a fair reason," he said. She nodded and turned back toward the house. "Miss Hartwell." She stopped. "Your assessment will matter," he said, "even if the decision is already made. Someone ought to know what this land is worth before anyone decides what to do with it." She stood there a moment with her back to him, and the notebook in her hand, and the last of the afternoon light cutting sideways across the grass. Then she turned her head enough to say, "Thank you, Mr. Everhart." She went back to the house. She finished her assessment. She wrote 12 pages in her neat, careful hand, and when she was done, she sat with it in her lap and read it through and thought, "This is the most honest work I have done in months. Maybe longer." And then Charles's letter was there on the corner of the desk. Organized and affectionate and already decided, and she looked between the two for a long time. She put the letter away. She kept the assessment on top. That night at supper, Porter talked about the coming autumn roundup, and 2 of the younger hands argued good-naturedly about something she didn't follow. And across the table, Samuel Everhart ate in his quiet way and said very little, and at one point looked up and found her already looking, and did not look away immediately. Just held for 1 second before going back to his food, as if looking at her had simply been one more honest thing in a day full of honest things. She was still thinking about that when she heard Gus's voice outside, sharp, clipped, the tone men use when something has gone wrong, and they have not yet decided how wrong. She was at the window before she decided to move. 3 horses in the yard. 2 strangers and one she did not recognize. A man in a better coat than anyone wore out here had reason to wear. Sitting a gray horse with the ease of someone who owns things and knows it. He was talking to Porter, and Porter had both hands up in the particular posture of a man trying to be reasonable while not feeling reasonable at all. She went outside. The man on the gray horse saw her before Porter did, and something shifted in his expression, not surprise. "Exactly. Reassessment, Miss Hartwell." He did not get down from the horse, which told her everything about how he understood the relative importance of people in this yard. "James Aldridge. I have property east of here. I was hoping to speak with the owner. The owner is in Denver." She stopped at the bottom of the porch steps. "I'm managing in his absence." "Ah." He looked at her with the particular patience of a man who has decided to wait out an obstacle rather than argue with it. "I had an arrangement with the previous manager. Seasonal access to the creek draw for my cattle. I'd like to confirm it will continue," Porter said. Carefully, "There was no formal arrangement, Mr. Aldridge." "There was an informal. There was an understanding," Aldridge said, in a tone that made understanding sound like something Porter had invented to make himself feel better. "My cattle have watered at that draw for 6 seasons. That's prior use. That's established access." Evelyn looked at him steadily. "Do you have a written agreement?" "I have 6 years of use." "That is not the same thing as an agreement." He looked at her with a smile that was entirely polite and entirely cold. "Miss Hartwell, I'm sure your father will want to maintain good relations with neighboring properties. I'd hate for a misunderstanding to complicate the otherwise straightforward business of running this operation." He paused, particularly given that the South Pasture water situation is already uncertain. She felt the sentence land. He knew about the South Pasture. He knew about the water situation. He had been paying attention to this property in ways that had nothing to do with casual neighborliness. "I'll pass your concern to my father," she said, in writing. With the full context, something moved behind his eyes barely. Quickly contained. He touched his hat brim, of course. "Good evening." He turned his horse, and his two men followed, and she watched them go until the sound of hooves was entirely gone. Porter stood beside her. He had the look of a man who has been holding his breath. "He's come by twice before, while you were here." She turned to look at him. "Twice, once the first week, once last Tuesday. I didn't think it was worth." He stopped. "I should have told you." "Yes," she said. "You should have." She looked at the gate they'd ridden through. "What exactly was this informal understanding?" "I let his cattle water at the draw on dry weeks." Seemed neighborly. "I didn't think, how many dry weeks?" "Last 3 summers." "Maybe 4. She stood with that information for a moment. 6 years, prior use. A man on a gray horse who knew the precise vulnerability of the South Pasture water situation before she had sent a single page to Denver. "Porter." Her voice was level. "Tomorrow morning I need you to pull every land record this property has. Every survey note. Every fence line document. Everything, Miss Hartwell. It's probably nothing." "It is not nothing." She looked at him directly. "Pull the records." She went inside. She did not go back to the supper table. She went to the writing desk and opened her notebook to a fresh page and wrote what she had just seen: the gray horse. The better coat. The smile, the sentence about good relations and uncertain water. She wrote it precisely, without interpretation, the way she had learned to write about the land itself. What was actually there, not what she wished was there. Everhart appeared in the doorway 20 minutes later. He did not knock. The door had been open. "Porter told me." She kept writing. "He told you what exactly?" "That Aldridge came." A pause. Again. She looked up. "You knew about the other visits." "I knew." "And you didn't." "I told Porter both times." His voice was even, but underneath it was the same thing she had heard once before: the weight of a man who knows his place and has not made peace with it. Porter decided it was a neighbor dispute, not a crisis. She put down her pen. "Is it a crisis?" He came fully into the room and stood with his hat in his hand. "Aldridge made an offer on this property 2 years ago. Your father turned it down. Since then he's been patient. In the way that men who have plans are patient. He's building a case for prior use. He's been building it for 4 years. He held her gaze. If he can establish water access rights through consistent use, the property value drops significantly, enough that even a declined offer might become attractive if the owner gets frustrated enough." She sat very still. "That's not a water dispute, no. That's a long game to force a cheap sale." "Yes." She looked at her notebook and then back at him. "You've known this for how long?" "Long enough to know I had no authority to act on it. But I do." He looked at her steadily. "You do." She turned back to her notebook and wrote 3 more lines in the small, precise hand that meant she was being very careful. Then she said, without looking up, "Sit down, Mr. Everhart." "I have more questions." He sat. They talked for an hour. And when they were done, she had 4 pages of notes and a clear picture of something that had been growing quietly in the ground under this property for years. Patient and invisible, and waiting for the right conditions. The wrong person would have panicked. The wrong person would have wired Denver immediately and waited for someone else to decide. She did not wire Denver that night. She finished her notes. She reviewed her 12 pages with new eyes and circled 3 passages that now meant something different than they had when she wrote them. Then she went to bed. She slept better that night than she had in weeks, not because everything was safe, but because she finally understood the shape of what wasn't. And knowing the shape of a problem, in her experience, was the beginning of the only kind of safety that actually holds. She did not ask herself why Everhart had stayed an hour past any professional obligation. That was the most honest lie she told herself all summer. She sent her assessment to Denver the next morning. All 12 pages of it, folded and sealed and handed to the postwriter, who came through every Thursday. And when it left her hands, she felt something she recognized after a moment as satisfaction, clean and quiet. The kind that doesn't need anyone else to confirm it. Porter saw her watching the writer go and said, "Good work on those pages. Miss Hartwell, I read what you left on the desk last night." You caught things I'd stopped seeing. You see them, she answered. You just stopped writing them down. He had the grace to look mildly embarrassed. Mr. Whitmore won't expand, you know. Your father told me as much in his last correspondence. I know what Mr. Whitmore will do. Then why the 12 pages? She turned away from the gate. Because the land deserved an honest account of itself. Porter said nothing to that. There was not much you could say to that. She had 3 more days before her scheduled return to Denver. And she spent them the way she had learned to spend time she did not know how to want usefully. Methodically, one task behind the next, she reviewed the barn inventory with the youngest hand, a boy of about 19 named Cooper who spoke too fast and knew more than he thought he did. She walked the creek line Porter had mentioned, the one that could be redirected if someone decided this land was worth the investment. And she stood beside it for a while, listening to the water and thinking about the word investment, and what it meant to put your resources into something you believed had future value. She thought about Charles. She thought about Denver. She turned away from the creek and walked back. Everhart was at the water pump when she came through the yard, working the handle with the slow rhythm of a man filling a trough, not paying particular attention to anything except the job in front of him. She passed within 10 feet of him, and he glanced up and then did something unexpected. He stopped pumping. Miss Hartwell, she stopped. Mr. Everhart. The creek's running lower than it looks from the bank. He said it without preamble, which was his way. There's a gravel bar about 40 yards east that's been building since June. Changes the flow. She looked at him. You watched me walk down there. I watch everything on this property. It's my job. And the gravel bar affects the irrigation on the south pasture. You'll want to note it if you haven't. She had not noted it. She pulled her notebook from her coat pocket and wrote it in, standing right there by the pump while he watched. 40 yards east, she said. Give or take, thank you. He nodded and went back to pumping. She stood there one more second, which she recognized as 1 second longer than was strictly necessary, and then kept walking. That night at supper, Cooper asked her what Denver was like, with the earnest curiosity of someone who had never been farther east than Pueblo. And she told him about the buildings going up on Larimer Street and the new electric lights they were talking about running along Colfax. And he listened with his fork halfway to his mouth, like a boy hearing about a place he was not sure was real. You ever want to go back? He asked. I live there, she said. Going back isn't a question. I meant, do you want to? The table got a little quieter than it had been. Porter looked at his plate. The other hand, a lean, weathered man named Gus, studied his coffee cup with great interest, and Everhart, who was sitting at the far end of the table as he usually did, looked up. She said, I want what's waiting for me there, which was not the same answer. And she knew it, and she did not look at Everhart when she said it. Cooper nodded as if that made sense, because at 19 most things sound like they make sense. After supper, she was on the porch again. It had become her habit in the evenings. The porch and the dark and the stars, and she heard the door open behind her and half expected Porter, who sometimes came out to smoke. But the step was different, lighter and more deliberate. Everhart came to stand at the far end of the porch railing. Not close, appropriate distance. He had his hat on, which meant he was not planning to stay. Long days, he said. By way of conversation or perhaps explanation. They are, she agreed. A silence settled between them that was not uncomfortable, which was itself a thing worth noticing. Most silences between people who don't know each other well have an edge to them, a feeling that someone ought to be doing something about them. This one just sat there peaceably, like it had a right to be there too. Can I ask you something? She said. You can ask. The ranch your family lost. Do you miss it? He leaned on the railing and looked out at the dark. Every day. But you don't talk about it. Talking doesn't change the deed records. She considered this. No, but it might change how it sits inside you. He turned his head and looked at her with that level, unhurried attention, and this time it lasted a beat longer than usual. Maybe, he said. Or maybe some things sit better when you leave them alone. Is that what you believe? Or what you've decided? The corner of his mouth moved barely. Almost nothing, but she was watching carefully enough to see it. Miss Hartwell, you ask harder questions than most lawyers I've dealt with. I ask the same questions. I just wait for the answers. Most people don't wait. Most people are afraid of what they'll hear. He looked at her for another moment and then looked back at the dark. The ranch was called the Double E. My father named it for himself and my mother. Eleanor and Eli Everhart. He said the names the way you say names you have not said out loud in a while, carefully. Like something you're setting down gently. 60 acres. Not big, but every fence post was one my father put in himself. She did not speak. She had asked the question. She was going to wait for the whole answer. Drought hit 2 years running, he continued. The bank was patient the first year. Less patient the second. My father sold the cattle first. Then the equipment, then the land. He was dead inside 8 months of signing the deed over. He paused. Not from grief. From a bad winter and a chest that had been weak for years. But I've always thought they were related. I think so too, she said quietly. You don't know my father. I know what it does to a man to lose the thing he built. He was quiet for a moment. Your father's built quite a bit. He has. She watched her own hands on the railing. And he's already decided what to do with it. He decided before I got here. The 12 pages I sent won't change his mind. Then why does it matter to you? She thought about it honestly before she answered. Because I needed to know I could do the work. That I could look at something complicated and see it clearly and write it down without anyone telling me what I was supposed to find. She paused. That may sound small to you. It doesn't sound small at all. The sincerity of it caught her off guard. She had expected something polite. Something appropriate, the kind of response men give women when they're trying to be encouraging without meaning it fully. That was not what she heard in his voice. She heard someone who actually understood what she had just said. She did not know what to do with that, so she did the thing she was good at. She changed the subject. You've been at this ranch how long? Going on 4 years. You like it here. It's honest work. The land doesn't pretend to be something it isn't. She almost laughed. Unlike Denver. I wouldn't know about Denver. You'd know in about 20 minutes. This time the corner of his mouth went further. Not quite a smile, more the precursor to one the terrain before the thing itself. Good night, Miss Hartwell. Good night, Mr. Everhart. She listened to his boots on the porch steps and across the hard ground. And then she sat for a very long time in the dark, with her hands in her lap, and thought about a man who named his ranch for himself and his wife, and put in every fence post himself. And about 60 acres and deed records, and the things that sit better when you leave them alone. And she thought, I am going to marry Charles Whitmore. I am going to go back to Denver and marry Charles Whitmore and live a life that other people have agreed is good. She told herself this with some firmness. It did not take the way she expected it to. The next morning she was up before anyone else, which she had taken to doing. There was something about the early light out here that felt honest in a way she was becoming addicted to. A quality of the world before it had dressed itself for public viewing. She was at the writing desk, working on a letter to Charles, when she heard shouting from the direction of the south pasture. She was on her feet before she had decided to stand. By the time she reached the fence, half the ranch was already there. Porter red-faced and urgent. Cooper white-faced and wide-eyed. Gus doing something fast with a rope. And Everhart in the middle of it all, already inside the pen. Already moving toward the problem before anyone had finished explaining what the problem was. One of the younger bulls had gone through a weak section of fence overnight and wedged himself in a drainage gully at an angle that was dangerous for the animal and for anyone trying to extract him. 2 of the hands were pulling from the rope end and losing ground. And the animal was panicking, which made everything worse. And Porter was giving instructions that no one was following because the instructions were wrong. Everhart saw it in about 4 seconds. He did not shout over Porter. He did not argue. He simply changed position, moved to the left flank instead of the front. Put his body between the animal and the fence, and in a voice so quiet she could barely hear it from the rail. He talked to the bull, not words exactly. A sound. Low and rhythmic and completely without fear. The bull's ears moved. Give him room on the right, Everhart said, still in that same low tone. And Gus moved without questioning it, and Cooper moved without questioning it. And then there was a long, horrible moment where nothing happened and everything was still, and she was gripping the fence rail without realizing it. The bull moved right. Everhart moved with him. Same pace. Same rhythm, and 30 seconds later, the animal was out of the gully and moving toward the open gate, as if he'd decided to do it himself. The yard let out a collective breath. Porter said something about the fence section needing immediate repair. Cooper looked like he might need to sit down. Gus coiled his rope with the satisfaction of a man who knows he was useful. Everhart came out of the pen dusting his hands on his thighs. Hat pushed back an inch and found her at the fence rail before he found anyone else. He looked at her hands on the rail. "You were worried," he observed. The animal could have broken a leg, yes. Or worse, yes. She let go of the rail and straightened. "That was what you did in there. How you spoke to him. My father taught me." He said it simply. He said cattle aren't stupid. They just don't speak English. She thought about this. Most people don't extend that kind of patience to things that can't argue back. Most things that can't argue back deserve the most patience. She looked at him for a moment. "Your father sounds like he was a good man." Something moved across his face, brief, honest, and immediately contained. He was. Cooper appeared at Everhart's elbow needing something, and Everhart turned to handle it, and she walked back to the main house and stood at the writing desk in front of the letter she had started to Charles and read what she had written so far. She had written 2 sentences. Both of them were about the weather. She put the pen down. She did not pick it up again that morning. Charles's response to her assessment arrived 2 days before her scheduled departure. It was prompt. Charles was always prompt, and it was kind. In the way that Charles's letters were always kind, which was to say warm in construction but decisive in content. He thanked her for the thorough work. He said her father had reviewed the pages and agreed with his earlier assessment. He said the property would be listed with an agent in the autumn, and that the capital from the sale would be very useful in their first years of marriage. He said, "I know how much effort you put into this, my dear, and I want you to know I read every page." She stood at the writing desk for a very long time after reading that letter. Then she went outside and walked to the east fence line. Not because she had any business there, but because walking was the only way she knew to think. And the east fence line was the farthest point from the main house, and she needed to be far from everything familiar for a few minutes. Everhart was mending wire near the 3rd post when she arrived. He looked up and then, apparently deciding her expression required no comment, looked back at the wire. She stood beside him and watched him work, and after a minute she said, "He read every page." Everhart pulled the wire taut and twisted the end to secure it. "But it didn't change anything." "No, you knew it wouldn't." "Yes." He moved to the next post and began the same process. "So what does that tell you?" That it wasn't about changing his mind. She had already known this. Saying it out loud was something else. It was about whether I could trust my own eyes. And I can. She looked at the fence post. "I can see things clearly. I just don't always have permission to act on what I see." He stopped working and looked at her steadily. "Miss Hartwell, you're 27 years old, and you just assessed a working cattle property more accurately than the man who's been managing it for 6 years. You have all the permission you need." The bluntness of it startled her. "That's you don't know. I know what I saw in those pages. Porter showed me. He had no business. He was proud of the work. He wanted someone to appreciate it." His voice was direct but not unkind. "You wrote the truth about this land. Nobody can take that back, regardless of what happens to the property." She looked at him. "Why does it matter to you?" He turned back to the fence. "It doesn't. Not my business." But he said it without conviction. And they both knew it, Mr. Everhart. He did not stop working. "Why do you always walk away when we start talking?" That stopped him. He stood with his hands on the wire, and his back partially to her, and she could see the set of his shoulders, careful, deliberate, the posture of a man who is making a decision in real time. He turned around. "Because some promises are heavier than feelings," he said. "And I'm not the kind of man who makes someone carry both at once." The silence that followed that was nothing like the comfortable silences they had shared on the porch. This one had weight, it had edges, it asked something of both of them. She was the one who looked away first. "I leave in 2 days," she said. "I know." She walked back toward the house without saying anything else. She spent the evening writing a proper response to Charles Warm. Organized, grateful for his attentiveness, asking about the plans for the autumn. She wrote it in her best hand. She sealed it and set it beside the outgoing correspondence for the Morning Post writer. Then she sat at the writing desk and looked at the wall for a while. She was engaged to Charles Whitmore. She was returning to Denver. She was going to marry a man who was stable and correct and who had read every page of her work, even when it didn't matter. These were facts. She repeated them to herself with the methodical patience of a woman who knows the difference between a feeling and a decision. She had made her decision, long before Colorado, long before this ranch and this fence line and a man who talked to frightened bulls with a voice like steady ground. She went to bed. She did not sleep for a long time. On her last full day at the ranch, Porter organized a simple meal for supper, and the hands were in better spirits than usual. And Cooper asked her 3 questions about Denver. She answered without thinking about the answers. And Gus raised his coffee cup in her direction in a wordless toast that she found unexpectedly moving. Everhart was present but quiet, which was not unusual. He ate at the far end of the table, same as always, and contributed to the conversation only when someone asked him something directly. She did not look at him more than was reasonable for someone seated at the same table. She looked at him a reasonable amount. After supper, the hands drifted off to the bunkhouse, and Porter excused himself, and the kitchen was being cleared by the cook's wife. And Evelyn went to the porch, because it was her last evening, and she thought she was entitled to it. He came out 20 minutes later. She had expected it and had decided not to expect it, which were 2 things that can coexist if you're determined enough. He stood at his end of the railing, and she stood at hers, and the dark was doing what the dark out here always did, which was to make the space between people feel both smaller and more significant. "You'll be glad to get back," he said after a while. "I'll be glad to sleep in my own bed," she said carefully. "That's not the same thing." "No, it isn't." He turned to look at her, and the directness of it was something she was going to have to get accustomed to not experiencing. "For what it's worth, and I don't expect it's worth much, I think you made the right choice coming here. You know things about this land now that nobody else bothered to learn. It'll be sold regardless." "Yes. But you'll know," she looked at him. "You keep saying that. That knowing matters even when nothing changes because of it." "It does matter." Why? He was quiet for a moment. "Because a person who knows what something is truly worth work, anything, that person can't be fooled into accepting less than it deserves." He paused. "That applies to more than cattle operations." She felt the sentence land somewhere it was not supposed to reach. "Mr. Everhart, I'm not asking anything," he said. And the steadiness in his voice was the most honest thing she had ever heard a man say. "I want to be clear about that. I'm not asking anything, and I won't. You have a life and a good man and a future that makes sense. I respect all of that. Then why? Because I'd rather say one true thing than nothing at all." He straightened from the railing. "And the true thing is, you're worth more than 12 pages that nobody's going to use. Worth more than a sale that was decided before you got here." He put his hat on. "That's not an argument, it's just the truth." She could not speak for a moment. "Good night, Miss Hartwell." He touched the brim of his hat. "Good night," she said. Her voice was steady. She was very proud of that. She watched him go, and then she turned back to the dark and the stars, and the silence that was not going to be available to her in Denver. And she pressed her hands flat on the railing, the same gesture she had made at the breakfast table in Denver when her father's letter arrived. Steadying herself against something pulling, and she stood there for a long time. Her heart was already promised. She had told herself this since the beginning. She had told herself this carefully and with conviction. And it was true. It was an honest fact. She was engaged to Charles Whitmore, and she had given her word, and her word meant something to her, which was one of the few things she was certain about herself. But standing on this porch on this last night, with those words still hanging in the air, a person who knows what something is truly worth cannot be fooled into accepting less than it deserves. She understood for the first time that a promise given without full knowledge of your own worth is not a complete promise. It is the best promise you could make at the time, which is not the same thing. She did not sleep at all that night. She was packed and in the carriage by 7 the next morning. And Porter shook her hand with both of his, and Cooper said, "Come back sometime." Miss Hartwell, with the earnest hope of someone who means it exactly as literally as he says it. Gus raised 2 fingers from the brim of his hat. Everhart was at the far gate, the one the carriage had to pass through on the way to the main road. He opened it as the carriage approached. The driver slowed and then stopped to let him work the latch. And for 10 seconds she was directly beside him, close enough that she could have spoken at a normal volume and been heard. He looked up, she looked down. "Safe travels," he said. "Thank you," she said. "For everything." He nodded once, and stepped back and held the gate open, and the carriage moved through. She did not look back. She looked forward the whole way to Denver. At the road unspooling ahead of her, at the country getting more organized and less honest the closer they got to the city. And she held her notebook in her lap without opening it. The 12 pages were already gone, sent and read and filed away. But she remembered every word of them. She remembered every word. Part 3, My Heart is Already Promised. Denver received her the way it always did, with noise and intention, and the smell of coal smoke and ambition layered over everything like a second atmosphere. Evelyn stepped down from the carriage at the Hartwell house on Monday morning and stood for exactly 3 seconds on the front walk, before the door opened and her mother appeared, which meant someone had been watching from the window, which meant her return had been anticipated and organized, in the way that everything in this house was anticipated and organized. "You look thin," her mother said by way of greeting. "I'm the same weight I left at. You look like you've been thinking too hard." Margaret Hartwell had the particular gift of making observations that were both true and unwelcome. "Charles is coming for dinner Friday, I know. He's been very patient. 3 weeks is not a long time." Mother, for Charles it was. She held the door open. "Come in. Your father wants a full report." The full report took the better part of 2 hours. Seated at the dining room table, with Gerald Hartwell at the head, and her mother at the side, and Evelyn's 12 pages spread between them. Her father read carefully. He was a thorough man. Whatever else might be said about him, and asked precise questions, and listened to her answers with an attention that she found, in spite of everything, gratifying. When he finished, he folded his hands on the table. "This is excellent work. Thank you. Charles was right about the sale. Of course, the return on investment won't justify the capital needed for expansion." She had known he would say exactly this. She had prepared herself for it, and yet something in her chest tightened anyway. A small familiar disappointment she was getting very good at not showing. "I understand. But this," he tapped the pages, "tells me you have a head for it. Land, assets, honest assessment. I underestimated that." She looked at him. Her father had never said anything like that to her in her memory. "You sent me there to confirm your own conclusion." "I did." He did not apologize for this. Gerald Hartwell rarely apologized, he acknowledged, which was its own form of honesty. "I was wrong to assume that was all you'd come back with." She folded her hands in her lap, the way her mother had taught her to fold them when she needed to contain something that had no appropriate outlet. "What will you do with the assessment?" "Keep it. When we list the property, I want the buyer to understand what they're getting. An honest account adds value even in a sale." He looked at her steadily. "You did good work, Evelyn. I won't forget it." She nodded and said nothing. And when dinner was over, she went to her room and sat at her own writing desk for the first time in 3 weeks, and looked at the familiar objects, arranged the way they always were, and felt, in the most complicated way possible, that she was home. She wrote to Charles that evening. A proper letter, warm and structured, telling him she was well and looking forward to Friday. She described the Colorado property briefly and professionally. She asked about his business, because his business interested him, and that was a worthwhile thing to know about someone you intended to marry. She sealed the letter and held it in her hands for a moment before setting it with the outgoing correspondence. Then she went to bed and dreamed about a fence line and a man who talked to frightened animals in a voice like steady ground. And when she woke, she told herself firmly that dreams were not evidence of anything. Friday arrived with the inevitability of Fridays. Charles came precisely on time. Because Charles was always precisely on time, and he brought flowers for her mother, which was correct and considerate, and a small leather-bound volume of Colorado territorial surveys for her father, which demonstrated that he had been paying attention to the family's recent business, which was also correct. For Evelyn he brought himself, which was considerable tall and well-dressed with those steady gray eyes and the particular quality of competence that surrounded him like a weather pattern. She had always admired that quality. She had told herself it was one of the things she loved about him. They sat in the parlor before dinner, and he asked about the journey and the property, and she answered carefully, offering the professional version, the version that matched his expectations. "Your father tells me you did thorough work," he said. "The land was worth understanding. You always were thorough." It was an admiring observation. He looked at her with the expression that meant he was pleased, which was a face she knew well. "I want you to know I didn't mean to presume when I wrote to your father about the sale." She had not expected him to raise this. "You didn't presume, you offered an opinion." "Yes. But I should have waited for your assessment first." He said it with genuine sincerity. "That was an oversight, and I'm sorry for it." She looked at him. Charles Whitmore had just apologized clearly and without qualification. She had not been certain he was capable of that, and the realization that he was made something in her feel complicated in ways she was not prepared for at a dinner table. "Thank you," she said. "That means something. You mean something." He reached across and covered her hand with his. "4 more months, Evelyn. Then we begin the real business." She smiled. She had always been able to smile when she needed to. 4 months. Dinner was pleasant. Her mother had outdone herself, and her father was in good humor, and Charles told a story about a contracts dispute that had resolved in his favor with considerable skill on his part, which he managed to make funny without making it self-aggrandizing, which was genuinely impressive. She watched him through dinner and thought, "This is a good man, a decent man, a man who apologizes when he's wrong and reads 12 pages of cattle assessment and brings her father territorial survey books because he pays attention. There is nothing wrong with this man." She watched him and thought this very carefully. And the careful quality of the thinking was, she recognized, itself a kind of answer to a question she had not fully asked. 3 weeks passed. She settled back into Denver the way you settle into a coat that fits, but has always pulled slightly at the left shoulder, familiar, functional, and with one small persistent awareness that you learn to stop noticing. She attended dinners. She called on friends. She began the practical business of wedding preparation, which her mother approached with the organizational intensity of a military campaign. Charles called twice a week, which was appropriate for an engaged man. He was attentive and consistent, and on 2 occasions brought her books he thought she'd enjoy. And on 1 occasion, he listened for 45 minutes while she talked about the Colorado assessment without interrupting or redirecting. And afterward he said, "You should have been advising me on land contracts years ago," and she could not tell whether he meant it or was being kind. She decided it did not matter. Either way, it was the right thing to say. October arrived and brought with it a letter from Porter, which surprised her. She had not expected to hear from the ranch again. He wrote to say that the property had a prospective buyer coming through in November, and he thought she'd want to know, and that Cooper had asked after her, and that Everhart had said to send his regards if Porter happened to be writing. She read that last sentence 4 times. She put the letter in the drawer of her writing desk, under several other papers, and did not take it out again. She was in the middle of a fitting for her wedding dress, standing on a low platform in her mother's dressing room, while Mrs. Aldrich made small adjustments to the bodice when Charles arrived unexpectedly on a Tuesday afternoon. Her mother showed him into the hallway with the cheerful pragmatism of a woman who did not consider a wedding dress fitting to be any barrier to hospitality. "He says it's important," her mother murmured through the door. "Tell him I'll be 20 minutes. He says it won't wait." She stepped off the platform before Mrs. Aldrich finished pinning the left side, which the seamstress bore with professional equanimity, and came into the hallway with the dress half finished and her hair pinned up carelessly, and an expression that asked the question without her having to speak it. He looked not distressed exactly, but something was working behind those steady gray eyes. "I've had a wire from my man in Glenwood Springs." Her stomach shifted. "The property?" "There's a complication with the prospective buyer." He took a folded paper from his breast pocket. "He wants to inspect the water situation on the east pasture before agreeing to terms. Porter says the creek's changed course slightly near a gravel bar, Everything in her went very still. A gravel bar 40 yards east, 40 yards give or take. He needs someone who's been there recently, Charles continued. Someone who knows the actual condition of the creek. Your father suggested you might go back to Colorado. Only for a few days. The buyer is serious and the timing matters. He paused. I know this isn't what either of us planned, but if the sale fails, it affects the capital we've been counting on. She stood in the hallway in a half-finished wedding dress, thinking about 12 pages and a fence line and a man who had told her once that a person who knows what something is truly worth cannot be fooled into accepting less. When, she asked. Friday's train if you agree. She looked at Charles. She looked at his steady gray eyes and his careful expression and his folded wire from Glenwood Springs. She thought about 4 months and the real business and a coat that pulls slightly at the left shoulder. I'll go, she said. The train reached Glenwood Springs by Sunday evening and Porter met her at the station in the wagon with his hat in his hands. Which meant something had gone sideways before she arrived. Which she had been half expecting from the moment she agreed to come. What happened, she said, before he could offer pleasantries. Buyer came Friday, spent 2 hours on the property. Left without committing. Porter climbed up beside her. His man has concerns about the water rights, not just the creek. Says someone filed a competing claim on the irrigation access in September. Who filed it? That's what we don't know. She sat with this for the length of the ride, out to the ranch. A competing claim on the irrigation access, filed in September. After she had sent her assessment to Denver. After Charles had already told her father the property should be sold. Porter, she said, who has the right to file a water claim on that access? Legally? Anyone who can document prior use. Or someone who bought access rights from the original deed holder. Who holds the original deed? Your father. She was quiet the rest of the way. The ranch was the same and not the same. The way places are when you've been away long enough to see them again, rather than simply inhabiting them. She noticed things she hadn't the first time: the slight lean of the bunkhouse roof, the good repair of the south fence line that had clearly been done recently, the way the yard had been raked clean. Cooper came out of the barn and grinned when he saw her. Miss Hartwell, figured you'd be back. You figured wrong. I'm only here for the water issue. Sure. He said it with the cheerful skepticism of a 19-year-old who hasn't yet learned to pretend. She did not ask about Everhart. She went inside and washed the train off her and changed her clothes and sat at the writing desk in the study and looked at Porter's account of the water claim situation until the words stopped being letters and became a shape she recognized. Someone had filed a claim on the irrigation access deliberately. After her report had made clear that the water rights were the most valuable single asset on the property. Someone had moved fast, between September and October, to complicate a sale that had not yet been announced publicly. The question was who had known about the report in time to act on it. She was still sitting with that question when she heard boots in the hallway. Not Porter's. She knew Porter's step by now. She did not move. The door was open. Everhart stopped in the doorway with his hat in his hand, which she had never seen before. He always wore his hat, even inside, unless it was the supper table. Holding it meant something deliberate. Porter said you were here, he said. I am. She looked at him. He looked the same, exactly the same, which she had not been counting on. Sit down, Mr. Everhart. I have questions. He came in and sat across the desk from her, which was not where she had expected him to sit, and the directness of it meant something. The water claim, she said. Did you know about it before Porter wired Denver? I knew about it the week it was filed, and you didn't notify Porter? I notified Porter. Porter notified your father's office in Denver. He held her gaze. No one responded. She absorbed this. Hall filed it. Man named Aldridge. He's got a property east of here. Claims his cattle have historical access to the creek draw, do they? His cattle used to water there years back, before a fence line changed the access point. It's a disputed claim, not a clear one, but it's enough to spook a buyer. Yes. She looked at him carefully. You said you notified Porter, but Porter acted like he found out from the buyer's man. Everhart was quiet for one beat. Porter forgets things sometimes, things that require decisions he doesn't feel authorized to make. He forgot to pass on a water rights dispute. He hoped it would resolve itself. She sat back in her chair. The situation had shape now, not a clean shape, but a shape she could work with. Porter had buried the notice, hoping the issue would go away. The issue had not gone away. The buyer had found it anyway, and now the sale was in trouble, and Charles was sitting in Denver with a financial plan built around capital that might not arrive. "Can the claim be contested?" she asked. "But it takes documentation. Proof of the original fence change. Proof of when access shifted. That paperwork exists. It's in your father's land records in Denver." "How do you know that?" "Because I helped Porter survey that fence line 4 years ago, and we documented everything. I know what we wrote down." She looked at him for a long moment. "You know what documentation needs to be retrieved and where it lives and what it would prove?" "Yes." "Why didn't you say so when the claim was filed?" He did not look away. "Because it wasn't my business to say." "Whose business was it?" "Your father's." "His property, his records, his decision." "But you could—" "I'm hired help." "Miss Hartwell." His voice was even, but she heard something under it, not bitterness, but the particular weight of a man who has known his place for a long time and has not made peace with it so much as learned to carry it. "I do what I'm hired to do. I don't make decisions about other men's land." She studied him. "You're telling me now," you asked. "You could have walked away when Porter told you I was here." He looked at her steadily. "Yes." She held his gaze for a moment longer than was entirely professional. Then she pulled her notebook from her coat pocket and opened it to a fresh page. "Tell me exactly what the documentation says. Every detail you remember," he told her. She wrote it down. His memory was precise and clear in the way that practical men's memories are when they have lived the facts rather than merely processed them, not organized like a ledger, but true in a way ledgers often aren't. When he finished, she reviewed her notes. "I need to wire Denver tonight. Post office closes at 6. She checked the small clock on the desk. 20 minutes. "Thank you," she said, already standing. "Miss Hartwell." She stopped. The claim. He paused, holding his hat in both hands now. "It's not just about the sale." She turned around fully. "What do you mean?" "Aldridge's claim, if it holds, affects the grazing rights on the south pasture permanently. Even after the property sells, the new owner would inherit the dispute." She had not thought that far. She stood very still and thought it now. "That changes the value of the sale significantly, and if the dispute isn't resolved before the listing, the sale will fail, or it'll go for a fraction of what the land's worth." She looked at him. "So someone wanted the sale to fail or to go cheap?" He did not answer that directly. He simply held her gaze with that steady quality, the one that gave her information without him having to say the thing out loud. "Who benefits if this property sells for a fraction of its value?" she said quietly. "A neighbor with a contested water claim and enough money to buy cheap. Aldridge. He made an offer on this property 2 years ago. Your father turned it down." She closed her notebook. "This isn't a water dispute, no. This is a coordinated attempt to devalue the property before purchase." He said nothing, which was its own answer. She moved fast. 20 minutes to the post office, and she used 15 of them, walking and thinking, and by the time she got there she knew exactly what to wire to Denver, not a request for guidance, not a question asking what to do. An instruction. She wired her father's office with the documentation requirements, the record location, the surveyor's name, and a direct note that said, "Do not proceed with any sale conversation until these records are in hand. This is the 12 pages speaking, trust it." She sent it and walked back to the ranch in the cold October dark and felt something in her chest that was not anxiety and not doubt, but something harder than either, a kind of clarity she had not felt since she'd been standing beside a creek thinking about the word investment. Everhart was still at the ranch when she got back, which she had not expected. He was at the paddock fence, doing nothing in particular, which for a man like him meant he was waiting. "It's sent," she said. "Your father will respond by morning." She stopped beside him at the fence. "You could have handled this without me. You knew the documentation. You knew the history. You knew Aldridge's motive. It's not my property, but you stayed. You've been managing this problem for weeks without authority to act on it." She looked at him directly. "Why?" He turned away from the fence and looked at her, and there was something in his face that had not been there during their last conversation, something more visible. less contained, as if Colorado nights and 4 weeks had worn through a layer of careful restraint. "Because this land deserves to go to someone who'll use it right," he said. "And because a fraudulent claim getting buried under a cheap sale is the kind of wrong that bothers me in the same place my father's deed used to bother me." She held his gaze. "And because you wanted me to come back." The words were out before she had fully decided to say them. He did not deny it. He did not confirm it. He stood with his hat in his hand and looked at her with that honest, level attention and said, "You made it clear what your life is. Miss Hartwell, I respect that. I've respected it since the morning you left. My heart is already promised." The words came out quietly, not as a statement of fact, but as the complicated thing they were. A true thing that had not gotten simpler since she'd said it on that porch and driven away. He looked at her, and his voice was quiet and direct, and without any performance at all. "Then I hope the man who owns that promise knows what he has." The sentence hit her differently than anything Charles had ever said. Not because it was an argument, because it wasn't. It was just true and undemanding, and it asked nothing of her except the honesty of acknowledging what it meant. She looked at him for a long moment. "Good night, Mr. Everhart," she said. "Good night." She walked inside. She sat at the writing desk for a very long time. Her father's response came at 7 the next morning, faster than she'd expected, which meant he had been in his office early, which meant the wire had reached him before closing, which meant someone had treated it with the urgency she had intended. The response said, "Records located. Surveyor confirmed. Aldridge claim is without legal merit. We are proceeding with documentation to the Territorial Land Office today." Well done. She read it twice. Then she read the second paragraph, which she had missed on the first pass. The second paragraph said, "Charles was here when the wire arrived. He asked to see it. I showed it to him. He said, and I quote this to you directly, 'Evelyn, she handled that better than I would have.'" She set the wire down on the desk. She sat with those 7 words for a long time. She had wanted Charles to see her clearly. She had spent 12 pages trying to prove that her judgment was sound. Had spent 3 weeks in Denver being warm and organized and correct. Had spent 4 years of courtship being the person he was expecting to marry. And in the moment she had acted on her own without asking, without deferring, without waiting for someone else to decide. He had looked at the result and said she had done it better than he could have. The acknowledgement was genuine. She believed that. Charles was not a man who offered false praise, which was one of the things she had always admired about him. But she sat at the writing desk in Colorado and held those 7 words and understood, with the particular clarity of a woman who has learned to trust her own eyes, that being told you did something better than expected is not the same as being known. It is not the same thing at all. She heard Porter's voice in the yard, and Cooper's answering laugh, and the ordinary morning sounds of a working ranch beginning its day. And she looked at the 12 pages she had written in this room 6 weeks ago and thought, "I know what this land is worth. I have always known what this land is worth." The question she had been avoiding, the one she had been calling a feeling, calling impractical, calling inappropriate, calling anything but what it was not about Colorado. It was about what she was worth, and whether the promise she was keeping had been made by the full version of herself, or by a smaller one who had not yet trusted her own eyes enough to see clearly. She closed the wire. She opened her notebook. She began to write. Part 4, the ride away from everything she knew. She wrote for 2 hours without stopping. Not a letter to Charles, not a wire to her father. Not another 12 pages of careful assessment, dressed in professional language that everyone would read and none would act upon. She wrote the truth, for herself, in the small, neat handwriting that got smaller and neater the more honest she was being. She wrote, "I have been keeping a promise I made before I knew what I was worth." She wrote, "That is not Charles's fault." She wrote, "That is not anyone's fault," she wrote. "A woman who cannot see her own value clearly cannot give an honest account of anything not land. Not promises, not herself." She filled 6 pages and then stopped and read them back, and felt the particular exhaustion that comes not from hard work, but from having finally said the true thing after a long time of saying the almost true thing. Then she closed the notebook, straightened her spine, and went to find Porter. He was at the barn with Cooper, going over the feed inventory, And he looked up when she came in with the expression of a man who has learned that when Miss Hartwell walks towards you with that particular posture, something is about to be decided. "I need to go back to Denver," she said. "Today's stage, if there's room. There's a noon stage." Porter looked at her carefully. "Everything all right. The water claim is handled. The documentation is in your father's, in Gerald Hartwell's hands. But the sale can proceed cleanly now." She had stopped herself on your father's because it had occurred to her, standing in the barn doorway, that she was not entirely certain Denver was still where she lived in the way she had always meant that word. Cooper looked between her and Porter with the wide eyes of someone who reads situations faster than he reads text. "You coming back again after?" "I don't know yet," she said, which was the most honest answer she had given in weeks. She was on the noon stage with her bag repacked and her notebook in her coat pocket. And she did not say goodbye to Everhart because she did not know where he was, and because she was not certain she could say it and mean only goodbye. The stage had 3 other passengers, a traveling merchant who slept most of the way, a woman about her mother's age with excellent posture, and a disapproving expression that softened considerably when Evelyn offered to share her reading material, and a young man who talked too much for the first hour, and then was talked into silence by the woman with excellent posture, which Evelyn found deeply satisfying. She spent the journey thinking. She did not think about Everhart, because thinking about Everhart was not useful right now. She thought about Charles. She thought about him with the honest, unflinching attention she had given the Colorado property, without sentiment, without defense, without the softening that comes from wanting to see something a particular way. Charles Whitmore was a good man. She had not been wrong about that. He was decent and consistent and had apologized cleanly for presuming on her assessment. And he had told her father she'd handled the water claim better than he could have. He was also a man who had decided what her life would look like before she had finished telling him what she saw. He was a man who loved the woman he expected her to be, and who was prepared to be genuinely surprised and occasionally impressed by the woman she actually was. But who had never, not once, not in 4 years of courtship, started from the assumption that the woman she actually was might have something to teach him. There was a difference. It was a significant difference. She had spent 4 years telling herself it wasn't. The stage arrived in Denver late on Tuesday evening, and she went directly home. Not to Charles, because what she had to say needed daylight and a clear head, and she had neither. She slept heavily and woke at 5 and lay in her own bed in her own room and stared at the ceiling and thought. Today she got up. She dressed carefully. She chose the blue wool, because Charles respected the blue wool, and this conversation deserved his full attention. She pinned her hair with the same care. She was not trying to be beautiful. She was trying to be taken seriously, which was a thing women of her time understood required preparation. She sent a note asking Charles to call at 10. He arrived at 5 past. Because he was Charles. Her mother opened the parlor door to offer tea, and Evelyn said, "We'll be fine, thank you, Mother," with a pleasantness that was load-bearing enough that Margaret Hartwell took one look and quietly withdrew. Charles sat across from her in the good chair, the one that put them at eye level, and he looked at her face for a moment before he said anything. "You've made a decision," he said, which was not a question. "Yes, about us?" She kept her hands in her lap, folded the way her mother had taught her, but she held his gaze without apology. "I want to be honest with you, Charles. You deserve that. And I owe it to us both. Go ahead. You are a good man. I have believed that from the beginning, and I believe it now. What I'm about to say is not an argument against your character, but I am going to say no." The silence that followed was the longest she had ever sat through in that parlor. She counted it by heartbeats. Charles's face did not collapse. He was not that kind of man. What it did was something more precise, a controlled adjustment, like a building settling after a tremor, finding its new configuration. "Is there someone else?" She thought about how to answer that. "There is someone who reminded me what it feels like to be seen clearly." That is not the same thing, a cowboy. She had not told him about Everhart. She had not needed to. A man who was honest with me when honesty cost him something. And I haven't been honest. You've been kind. You've been consistent. You've done everything correctly. Charles, that's the truth of it. She leaned forward slightly. But you decided who I was going to be before I finished becoming it. And I let you. That's on me as much as you. He looked at her with those steady gray eyes, and she saw something move through them that she had not expected, not anger, not wounded pride, but something that looked like recognition. You're right, he said quietly. I did do that. She had not expected him to agree. It caught her so off guard that for a moment she could not speak. I have been, he paused and chose the word with care. Exact in how I arrange things, including you. He folded his own hands, mirroring her posture, which she did not think he noticed. I wanted the right life, Evelyn. I believed you were part of the right life. I know. I'm not certain. I asked whether I was part of yours. No. You didn't. He sat with that. He sat with it the way a fair man sits with an unfair truth, not defending himself, not collapsing, just holding it and seeing what it actually weighed. Is this? He nodded. One short nod. Your father. I'll speak to him today. He won't be pleased. He'll respect honesty. Eventually, the corner of Charles's mouth moved. Almost imperceptibly, he raised you to see land clearly. And look what happened. She had not expected that. She had not expected any of this, really not his composure. Not his acknowledgement, not the small dark humor at the end. It made her chest ache in a way that had nothing to do with regret and everything to do with the genuine loss of something that had been real. Even if it had not been right. I'm sorry, Charles. Don't be. He stood, straightening his jacket with the automatic precision of a man returning himself to order. Be certain. That's worth more than sorry. He let himself out. She sat in the parlor alone for 10 minutes before she heard her mother's careful step in the hallway. Margaret Hartwell came in and sat across from her, in the chair Charles had vacated, and looked at her daughter with an expression that was not what Evelyn had been bracing for. It was not outrage. It was not the controlled panic of a woman watching the scaffolding of a plan come down. It was exhaustion, familiar, intimate, the kind you recognize in someone because you've seen it in your own mirror. How bad is it? Evelyn asked. Your father will need a week. Her mother's voice was level. I'll manage your father. I'm sorry to... Don't apologize for wanting the right thing. Margaret Hartwell looked at her hands. I had the right man, Evelyn. I want you to know that. Your father and I, we had the right thing. But I accepted the shape he put me in, rather than asking whether the shape fit. She looked up. I always thought you'd be smarter about that than I was. Evelyn stared at her mother. In 27 years, she had never heard her say anything close to that. Mother, go speak to your father. Margaret stood. The sooner the better. And Evelyn, whatever is in Colorado that put that look on your face, don't dawdle about it. Women of our family have a talent for dawdling and calling it patience. She left the parlor without looking back. Evelyn sat for another minute in the rearranged quiet. Then she went to find her father. Gerald Hartwell's reaction was, as predicted, not quiet. He was not a screaming man too controlled for that, but he had a voice that could fill a room without raising. And he filled it now. He talked about contracts and reputation and Charles Whitmore's standing and what this would mean at the club and whether she had actually thought about the implications. She let him talk. She had learned this from watching him. You let a man who runs on momentum exhaust the momentum before you say the thing that needs to be said. When he stopped, she said, I assessed the Colorado property honestly. Even when the decision was already made. Even when no one was waiting for the answer. He looked at her. You told me it was good work. You said you wouldn't forget it. This is a different matter entirely. It's the same matter exactly. Her voice was quiet, but it was not small. I assessed what I saw honestly, and I wrote it down, and I stood by it. I'm doing the same thing now. Gerald Hartwell was a man who understood the argument of principle. He was not always comfortable with it when it applied to him personally. But he understood it. He stood at his desk and looked at his daughter, and she could see him working through several responses and discarding them one by one. Finally, the water claim is resolved? Yes. The documentation is filed. The sale can proceed. Yes. He turned toward the window. Give me a week. I'll give you as long as you need. I said a week. A pause. And Evelyn, whatever comes next, come to me first. Not after. Yes, sir. She walked out of his office and down the front steps of the Hartwell house and stood on in the October air, and let herself breathe for the first time in what felt like days. The next 72 hours were the strangest of her life. The news moved through Denver society the way all such news does, invisibly and immediately, carried on no specific current but arriving everywhere at once. She went to call on a friend Thursday morning and knew from the parlor maid's expression before she was inside that the parlor maid had heard. She attended a shop on Larimer Street Friday afternoon, and the shop girl was too carefully natural to be natural at all. She held her chin level and her expression composed, and she did not explain herself to anyone, because she had decided standing at her writing desk on the morning after the conversation with Charles that she did not owe Denver an explanation. She owed it her good behavior. She had been behaving well for 27 years. She could afford to keep going. What she had not anticipated was the letter. It arrived Saturday morning, written in a hand she did not recognize at first because she had seen it on functional documents, neat and spare, and economical. The handwriting of a man who says what he means and not more than that. She sat down before she finished opening it. Everhart wrote, "Miss Hartwell, Porter told me you'd return to Denver and that the water matter was resolved. I'm glad. You did good work on it, same as before. I'll be moving on from this property in December when my current contract ends. I wanted you to know that before I left in case knowing mattered. I don't expect anything by this. I just didn't want to be the kind of man who disappeared without saying so. S. Everhart." She read it 3 times. "Moving on in December. Contract ends." She put the letter down on the desk and stood up and walked to the window and stood there for a full minute. Then she walked back to the desk and wrote a response. She wrote, "Mr. Everhart, I am no longer engaged to Charles Whitmore. This is recent and I will not claim it is without difficulty. I am not writing to make a claim on you or to imply any obligation. I am writing because you said you didn't want to disappear without saying so. And I want you to know that I understand that, and I feel the same way about honest correspondence. If you find yourself passing through Denver before December, there is something I would like to say to you in person. If you don't, I understand that too. E. Hartwell." She sealed it before she could change her mind. She sent it before she could change anything else. His response came 4 days later, which was fast for the distance, which meant he had written back immediately. It said, "I'll be in Denver on Thursday next. S.E." She held that piece of paper and felt something she had not felt in as long as she could accurately remember something uncomplicated. Not the satisfaction of 12 good pages, not the clarity of a decision correctly made. Something simpler and more animal than either. She was frightened, and she was glad, and the two feelings occupied the same space without fighting each other, which she understood was what honest things do. Thursday arrived, and she met him at the parlor door herself, because she had told her mother she was expecting a caller, and her mother had looked at her face and chosen wisely not to ask questions. He came in with his hat in his hand, clean-shaved, which she had not seen, in better clothes than the ranch, which she had not seen, and he looked around the Hartwell parlor with the honest appraisal of a man encountering a new landscape. Neither dazzled nor dismissive, just present. "Thank you for coming," she said. "Thank you for the letter." They sat across from each other at appropriate distance, and she thought, "We are two people who have spoken honestly to each other a handful of times across 3 months. And neither of us knows quite what we are doing, and I have not felt this certain of anything in years." "I wasn't sure you'd write back," she said. "I almost didn't." He turned his hat in his hands. "I don't have land, Miss Hartwell. I don't have prospects beyond a cowboy's wage and a record of good work. I'm aware of the difference between what I am and what you're accustomed to. I've been accustomed to a great many things that didn't fit. That's not a plan for the future. No, it's not." She held his gaze. "But I have a father who is reconsidering whether that Colorado property should be managed rather than sold. And a family name that means something in this territory. And 12 pages of assessment that proved I can see clearly even when no one asks me to." She paused. "And I have 4 years of practice at building a life around someone else's certainty. I would like this time to build something around my own." He was quiet for a moment. "What are you asking?" "I'm asking if you'll let me know you honestly, before either of us decides anything." She kept her voice steady. "Not a promise, not a plan, just honesty. Between two people who haven't lied to each other yet." He looked at her for a long time with that level, unhurried attention. I grew up on 60 acres that were taken away, he said. I've spent 10 years working other men's land and telling myself that's enough. It mostly is. He paused. But there are days when I look at a piece of good ground and I think if I were keeping that, this is what I'd do. And then I keep moving. What would you do with the Colorado property, she asked. If it weren't being sold. He blinked, because it was not the question he'd expected. Redirect the creek, he said after a moment. Like we talked about. Add a well on the south end, expand the herd slowly. 2 seasons. Build a working relationship with the rail contracts out of Glenwood before trying to go bigger. That's almost exactly what my 12 pages said. I know. I read them. Porter showed everyone my pages. Porter was proud of the work. Can't blame him, his mouth moved toward a smile. You wrote what was true about that land. It deserved to be read. She took a breath. Ride out with me tomorrow, he went still. Miss Hartwell, not away from anything. She was careful with this. Because it mattered. Just away from this parlor and this house and every conversation that has eyes on it. I want to ride out and talk like we talked at the fist line. Without any of this around us. She gestured at the room. Meaning everything the room represented: the good furniture, the careful arrangements, the weight of the Hartwell name pressed into every surface. One afternoon, he looked at his hat. He looked at her. He made whatever decision a man makes when he has been practical his whole life and is being asked to consider something that is not quite practical yet. One afternoon, he said. They rode out the next morning on 2 horses from the Hartwell stable, on the gray mare she had ridden since she was 17. Him on a roan that the stable hand saddled with a respect that suggested Everhart had made a good impression before she arrived. They rode east, away from the city, into the country that got quieter the farther you went. And for the first hour they did not talk much, because they were learning the rhythm of moving through the same space at the same pace, which is its own kind of conversation. Then she said, "Tell me about the double E." He looked at her sideways. "I already told you. You told me the facts of it. Tell me what it looked like." He was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, his voice had a different quality, looser. Less careful, the way a voice gets when a person stops deciding what to share and just shares. He told her about the 60 acres and the kitchen garden his mother kept and the particular way the morning came over the East Ridge in July. He told her about the summer he was 14 and his father let him run a fence line alone for the first time, and he did it wrong twice before he did it right. And his father never said a word about the first 2 times. Just looked at the finished line and nodded. She listened the way she had always listened when it mattered completely, without organizing her response while he spoke. "Your father sounds like he was patient with the things worth being patient for," she said. "He was." A pause. "He would have liked this country out here. He would have liked you to have it." He turned and looked at her directly. "What are you saying, Miss Hartwell?" "I'm saying my father is reconsidering the sale." She had spoken to Gerald Hartwell 2 evenings ago, and the conversation had been careful and honest, and longer than either of them intended. And at the end of it, her father had said, "Tell me what you think the right thing to do with that land is." And she had told him, "I'm saying the property might be managed rather than sold. And I'm saying that if it were managed, it would need someone who knew it. Who knew the creek and the gravel bar and the south pasture water situation and the precise terms of a contested claim that tried to steal it." Everhart reined in. She reined in beside him. "Evelyn." He said her name for the first time. Not her title, just her name. And it had the same quality as when he said his father's name, careful. Like something set down gently. "I am not going to be offered a ranch because a woman finds me interesting. I'm not offering you a ranch." She met his eyes without wavering. "I'm telling you that a piece of land that I know the value of is not going to be sold at a fraction of its worth to a man who tried to steal it. And that it needs someone honest to run it. And that in my experience, there is exactly one person in this territory who qualifies." She paused. "The conversation about anything else comes after. Separately. On its own terms." He looked at her for a long time. "You do that thing," he said finally. "What thing?" "Make hard things sound reasonable." But there was something in his face that had not been there before. Something that had been building across months and conversations and fence lines and had run out of patience with being contained. "One condition, name it." Nothing is decided by anyone else. No arrangements. No family business. If something is decided between us, it's decided by us. She felt the sentence in her chest. Agreed. He held out his hand. She took it. They shook hands at the edge of a Denver morning like two people, concluding the most important transaction either of them had ever entered. And then they sat on their horses in the October light, and neither of them said anything for a moment. Because some things that are true don't need immediate words. Then he said the creek redirect. You'd need a surveyor first. I know a surveyor. He's in the family land records. And the South, well, I know a man who knows where to dig it. He looked at her. She looked at him. 40 yards east, she said, give or take. And for the first time in all the months she had known him, Samuel Everhart smiled fully, completely, without reservation, and it was exactly what she had suspected it would be when she first noticed the territory it occupied just short of his expression. It was worth the wait. They rode back toward Denver at the same unhurried pace. In the direction of everything that still needed to be done, the conversations and the complications and the slow work of building something from honest ground up. None of it was simple. None of it was settled. But she was riding toward it instead of away from it. And the difference between those two directions was the whole of everything. Part 5, the promise she finally chose, the week after they rode back toward Denver. Everything got harder before it got easier. That was the part no one talked about, the space between a decision and its consequences. Where the air is thin and the ground is unsteady, and you have to keep walking anyway, because turning back would cost more than going forward. Evelyn had made her choice with clear eyes. That did not make the weeks that followed painless. It made them survivable, which was different and which was enough. Gerald Hartwell's week passed and became 10 days and then 2 weeks, during which he was precise and civil at the dinner table and completely silent on the subject of Charles Whitmore in Colorado and anything that connected to either. Margaret Hartwell managed him the way she had always managed him, steadily. Without performance, with the particular patience of a woman who has spent 30 years understanding a complicated man and choosing, each morning, to stay. On the 15th day, Gerald came to the breakfast table and set a folded document beside Evelyn's coffee cup and sat down and picked up his fork. She looked at the document. What is this? Management agreement. He looked at his plate. For the Colorado property, 12-month term, renewable. Terms are standard percentage of net revenue, operational authority within approved capital limits. Quarterly reporting to Denver. She unfolded it. Read the first page. The second. This is a serious agreement. I make serious agreements. You know this. She looked up at him. You're keeping the property. I'm keeping the property for 12 months and seeing what an honest assessment and honest management can do with it. He picked up his coffee cup. You wrote 12 pages about what that land was worth. I'd like to know if you were right, and if I was. Then we'll have a longer conversation about whether the Hartwell family ought to be in the ranching business instead of merely adjacent to it. He met her eyes briefly over the cup. This is not about the Cowboy. I know. The management position is offered on the merits of your work. What you do with your personal life. He set the cup down. Your mother and I have discussed it. We are not entirely unsupportive. That was from Gerald Hartwell, approximately the equivalent of a standing ovation. Evelyn folded the agreement along its creases and held it in both hands and felt the clean, honest satisfaction of something that had been earned rather than given. Thank you, she said. Don't thank me. Prove the 12 pages. She sent a wire to Glenwood Springs that afternoon. She addressed it to Porter and asked him to pass the relevant information to Everhart before he received any other offers for the coming season. The return wire arrived the next morning, written in that spare economical hand. Understood. We'll stay through spring. Work to begin on creek redirect as discussed. S.E. She read it and set it next to the management agreement and looked at both for a moment. As discussed. Like it was the most natural thing. Like two people who had talked honestly at a fence line were simply continuing that conversation. Which was, she supposed, exactly what they were doing. She told her mother that evening. Margaret Hartwell listened to the whole account, the management agreement, the wire, the spring plans, and when Evelyn finished, her mother was quiet for a moment and then said, He held a gate open for you. I beg your pardon. The first time you left Colorado. He held the gate open as the carriage went through. She looked at her daughter. Porter mentioned it in his letter. He thought it was just courtesy. I thought it was a man making sure you got through safely even when he couldn't follow. She paused. That's worth something. Evelyn looked at her mother. When did you become an expert in cowboys? I've always been an expert in men who say the right thing without saying anything at all. She stood and smoothed her skirt. Go to Colorado, Evelyn. Do the work. See what's true. She left for Glenwood Springs on the first Friday of November, with the management agreement in her traveling case and her notebook in her coat pocket, and the particular feeling of a woman moving towards something rather than away from it for the first time in longer than she could honestly account for. Porter met her at the station again, same hat in hands. But his expression this time was different, less uncertain, more straightforward, the face of a man who has been told clearly what's happening and has decided he approves. Good to have you back, Miss Hartwell. Good to be back. Porter. She looked at him. We have work to do, yes. Ma'am. Everhart's already started on the survey stakes for the creek redirect. She had not expected him to start without her. She did not know why everything she knew about him said he would begin the moment the work became authorized. Because that was how he operated. She felt something warm and uncomplicated move through her chest. Take me there, she said. They found him 200 yards from the main house at the creek bend. Working with a surveyor, she did not recognize a compact, methodical man who turned out to be named Briggs, who had worked the territorial surveys in the early 80s and who, Everhart explained later, had been the one who documented the original fence line change that defeated Aldridge's water claim. You hired the surveyor, she said to Everhart when Briggs was occupied with his instruments. Briggs agreed to come out before the ground freezes. Seemed like the right time. I hadn't authorized the expense yet. He looked at her directly. I paid him myself. You can reimburse me when the management agreement says you can. She studied him. You paid for a surveyor on a property you don't own. I paid for good information on ground worth having good information about. He held her gaze. Same reason you wrote 12 pages no one asked for. She could not argue with that. She pulled out her notebook. They spent the rest of the day at the creek with Briggs, walking the proposed redirect route and taking measurements and discussing the engineering and the practical, unsentimental way of people who care about whether something works rather than how it sounds. Everhart and Briggs had already identified the optimal point, the gravel bar. Naturally, the same one he had mentioned to her in September. Now staked and flagged and incorporated into a plan that was more detailed than she had expected. You've been planning this for a while, she observed. At one point since September, he did not elaborate. Since September, since before she'd come back the second time. Since before the water claim, before the management agreement, before any of it. He had been thinking about what this land could become, since before there was any reason to think it was going to matter to him personally. She wrote something in her notebook and did not say what she was thinking. Because what she was thinking was not about creek redirects. Cooper appeared at supper, looking genuinely delighted to see her, which was the most uncomplicated welcome she received from anyone that autumn, and which she found entirely refreshing. He had questions about Denver, and about whether she was staying, and about what they were doing with the South End. And she answered the first two, and handed the third to Everhart, who explained the South Well plan in the same patient, precise way he explained everything. She watched him explain it. She watched Cooper listen. She watched the other hands absorb the information and start asking their own questions. And she thought, this is what it looks like when people respect someone without being afraid of them. She had seen the other kind in her father's office, at dinner tables with men who commanded rooms through wealth and consequence. She had thought that was what authority looked like. It wasn't, this was. That evening she sat across from him at the small table in the study, which had become their working table, with the survey notes and the capital plan and the quarterly reporting format spread between them. It was entirely professional. It was also, she recognized, the most natural she had felt in any room with any person in years. The well cost is the variable, he said, tracing a column in the survey notes. If we hit water at 40 feet, it's manageable. 60. It changes the first quarter picture. We plan for 60 and treat 40 as a surplus. Agreed. He made a note. The herd expansion 2 seasons like we said. First spring, 15 head. Second spring reassess. Can Cooper manage the additional herd? He's better than Porter was giving him credit for. He looked up. You noticed that in the first week. He was solving problems. Porter was still describing. A pause. I'll move him to lead hand in March. He's ready. She made a note of this. Porter. Porter stays. He knows the operation. He just needs authority that's clearly defined. And someone to tell him it's all right to make a decision. He looked at her. He's been waiting for permission his whole career. A lot of people have. She held his gaze a moment longer than the conversation required. Then she looked back at the papers. Final item. The Aldridge situation. He's going to try again. Yes, not a water claim this time. He knows that won't hold, no. He'll try to buy access rights directly. Approach your father through legitimate channels. My father will refer him to me. Everhart looked at her steadily. You're certain of that? I have a management agreement and 12 pages, and a father who said prove it. She straightened the papers. I'm certain, he nodded slowly. Then we're ready for him. The Aldridge approach came in early December. Exactly as predicted. A letter arrived addressed to Gerald Hartwell in Denver, offering to purchase the creek access rights for what was framed as a generous sum. Gerald's response arrived at the ranch 3 days later, forwarded to Evelyn with a note in her father's handwriting that said only, "Your call." She wrote back to Aldridge directly in her own name, with the management authority cited clearly in the first line. And she declined the offer, and she noted that the Hartwell property was not in the business of selling access rights. And she thanked him for his interest in the region. She sent it and felt nothing dramatic about it. It was just the right thing. Done at the right time by the right person. What she did not anticipate was Aldridge arriving in person. He came on a Tuesday, without notice in a good coat, and with the particular bearing of a man who has gotten what he wanted through personal presence often enough to believe it always works. He was perhaps 50, well-built, with sharp eyes that took stock of the ranch yard in about 4 seconds. Porter came to find her immediately, and she went out to the yard calmly. Because this was her property to manage, and calm was its own form of authority. Aldridge looked at her and recalibrated visibly. He had expected someone older, she thought, or a man, Miss Hartwell. He offered his hand and she shook it. Because courtesy cost nothing, and she needed to hear what he had to say before she needed to say anything back. I appreciate you seeing me. I received your letter. I responded to it. Yes, and I wanted to discuss your response in person. I think there's a misunderstanding about what I'm offering. There's no misunderstanding. She kept her voice even. The access rights aren't for sale. The sum I'm prepared to offer is considerably more than. It's not a question of the sum. She looked at him steadily. This operation depends on that water access. Selling it at any price would undermine the property value significantly. We've done the assessment. He looked at her with a new kind of attention, the kind that is recalculating rather than dismissing. You've already done a full assessment. Yes. May I ask who conducted it? I did. She met his eyes. Twice. A silence. Then he turned his head, because Everhart had come out of the barn at some point during the conversation and was standing 20 feet away doing nothing in particular, which was its own statement. Aldridge looked at Everhart. Everhart looked back at him with the level, unhurried attention he gave everything. Aldridge turned back to Evelyn. The survey stakes along the creek bend. Those are recent November. You're redirecting the flow. That's our plan. Yes, he studied her. He was a man who understood property and investment and the long game. And she could see him working through the implications, the redirect, the survey, the assessment, the management agreement, the clear authority, the man in the background who knew this land better than he did. He was understanding, she thought, that the window he'd been planning to exploit had closed. You've moved quickly, he said finally. The land was worth moving quickly, for he was quiet for a moment. When he spoke again, the aggression had gone out of his voice, replaced by something that was almost respect, or the version of respect that men like Aldridge extend when they recognize they've encountered a position they cannot buy their way through. If you ever consider offers on the property itself, you'll be the first to know, she said it pleasantly. After about a dozen other conversations, he left without getting what he came for, and Porter watched his carriage go with the of a man who has just seen something he is going to tell people about for years. "And Cooper," said Miss Hartwell. That was something in a voice of genuine reverence. She walked back toward the house and found Everhart beside her, matching her pace. "You didn't need me there," he said. "No, I was there anyway, I noticed." She glanced at him. "Were you worried?" He considered this with his usual honesty. "I was ready. It's not the same thing." She stopped walking. He stopped beside her. "Sam." He turned at his name the way he'd turned when she said it the first time, with full attention. Nothing held back. "Thank you," she said, "for being ready." He looked at her for a long moment. "Evelyn, there is something I've been waiting to say since October, and I keep finding reasons to wait." She held his gaze. "Say it." "I don't have land. I have wages and a record of good work and a plan for someone else's property that I believe in." He stood with his hat in his hand. The same posture as the first day she'd seen him hold it, deliberately but different now. The deliberateness pointed somewhere specific. "I am not going to ask you anything that puts you in a position of deciding between your family and a cowboy. That's not what this is." "Then what is it?" "It's me telling you that I have not spent one day since September not thinking about the most honest person I have ever met." His voice was steady and direct and entirely without performance. "And that I would like, with your permission, and with whatever patience the situation requires, to earn the right to ask you something important. Not now, when it's right." She looked at him for a long moment. "You already have it," she said quietly. He blinked. "Just once. The permission," she clarified. "You already have that." What happened on his face then was not dramatic. It was not the kind of moment that makes noise. It was something quieter and more durable than that, a settling. A rightness. The expression of a man who has been carrying something careful for a long time and has just been told he can set it down. "All right," he said. "All right," she agreed. They walked back to the house and the work. And the work was good. And the days got colder, and the creek redirect survey was finalized, and the South Well plan was drawn, and Cooper was told he'd be led hand in March, and accepted this with the particular joy of someone who has been ready and just needed the word. She was still walking beside him when Porter appeared at the door, with an expression she had not seen on him before, not anxious, not flustered, but something flatter and more serious than either. He had a wire in his hand. "This came while you were with Aldridge." He held it out. "From Denver. From Mr. Hartwell's office." She took it. She read it standing in the doorway. It was not from her father. It was from her father's attorney, a man named Greer, who handled the formal correspondence when Gerald Hartwell wanted distance between himself and a decision. The wire said, "Miss Hartwell, be advised that Mr. Gerald Hartwell is reconsidering the terms of the current management arrangement following a meeting this week with representatives of the Denver Commerce Association. Concerns have been raised regarding the propriety of an unmarried woman managing a working ranch property in the company of male hired hands without appropriate supervision. Mr. Hartwell asks that you return to Denver at your earliest convenience to discuss the matter. No operational decisions should be made until this meeting occurs. R. Greer, Esquire." She read it twice. Then she folded it and put it in her coat pocket and stood very still for a moment while the yard went about its business around her. Everhart was watching her face. He had not read the wire. He did not need to. "Bad news, my father's attorney." She kept her voice level. "Someone has raised concerns with the Denver Commerce Association about a woman managing this property." A pause. "What kind of concerns?" "Propriety." She said the word, the way you say a word that is being used as a weapon while pretending to be a courtesy. "An unmarried woman, male hired hands. No appropriate supervision." The silence that followed had a particular quality, the silence of people who understand exactly what is happening and are deciding how angry to be about it. "Aldridge," Everhart said. "It was not a question. He came here and it didn't work. So he went around." She looked at the gate where the gray horse had gone through an hour ago. "He didn't go to my father directly. He went to the Commerce Association and let them go to my father. So it doesn't look like a land dispute. It looks like a community concern about propriety. That's." Cooper had appeared behind Porter and stopped himself. "Effective," she finished. "It's effective." She turned and went inside. She stood at the writing desk and looked at the wire again and felt the full weight of it, not just what it said but what it could do. Her father was a man who understood business clearly and family reputation almost as clearly. And the Denver Commerce Association was not an organization Gerald Hartwell could dismiss. If they had sent representatives to his office with concerns about his daughter's situation, he would feel the pressure of it, not because he was weak, because he was practical. And practical men, when pressed from enough sides, sometimes made decisions they later reconsidered, but later was a long time from now. The management agreement was 12 months. She had been here 6 weeks. She heard Everhart's step in the hallway and did not turn around. Don't say it was your fault. It's not your fault either. I know that. She set the wire down. I also know that it doesn't matter whose fault it is. It matters what I do next. What are you going to do? She turned around. I'm going to wire my father directly. Not Greer, my father. She pulled out her notebook. And I am not going to ask for permission to continue. I am going to send the quarterly numbers. He looked at her. You don't have the quarterly numbers yet. I have 6 weeks of numbers. The Creek Redirect Survey. Briggs's certification. The water table assessment for the South Well. Cooper's lead hand projections. She opened the notebook. I have 12 pages that were true in September and are truer now. I'm going to send all of it. And if he still wants you back in Denver. She looked up from the notebook. Then I will go to Denver. And I will sit across from my father, and I will show him every number, and I will ask him one question. She held Everhart's gaze. I will ask him whether the land is performing or it isn't. And if it is, which it is, I will ask him to tell me what propriety has to do with profit. He was quiet for a moment. Gerald Hartwell is a man who respects argument. He is a man who respects evidence. She was already writing. I have evidence. She wrote the wire to her father in 12 minutes. Not to Greer, not to the office. Directly to Gerald Hartwell at the house on Thursday evening, which was when he read his personal correspondence. She addressed him by name. She opened with the quarterly numbers' actual figures. The Creek Redirect cost versus the water table gain. The projected South Well output, the Aldridge claim defeated and documented at the land office. Then she wrote, I understand concerns have been raised about propriety. I want you to know who raised them and why. James Aldridge made an offer on this property 2 years ago that you declined. He has since spent 4 years attempting to devalue it through a water rights strategy that I identified and defeated in my first month of management. He is now attempting a second strategy through social channels. This is not a community concern. It is a business dispute conducted by other means. The question is not whether your daughter is managing the property appropriately. The question is whether you want the person who caught Aldridge's first move to be here when he makes his third. E. Hartwell. She sealed it and handed it to Porter for the Morning Post writer. Then she went to supper and ate and let Cooper talk and did not tell anyone what she had sent. Because she had sent it, and there was nothing to do now except work and wait and trust that her father was the man she believed him to be. Everhart caught her eye once across the table. She gave him nothing, not reassurance. Not anxiety, just the level look of a woman who has done what she could do and is at peace with the doing of it. He gave her a small nod that meant he understood. 3 days passed. The well survey progressed. Cooper made a decision about the feed distribution that was better than anything Porter had suggested, and she wrote it into the operational notes with his name beside it. Briggs finished his certification and rode back toward Glenwood Springs, leaving behind paperwork that was clean and final and legally unassailable. On the 4th morning, Porter came to the study with the look of someone carrying good weight rather than bad. He had a letter, not a wire. A letter in her father's handwriting. Gerald Hartwell wrote letters when he had decided something, and wires when he was still deciding. She opened it. Her father wrote, Evelyn, I spoke with 3 members of the Commerce Association personally. I told them the ranch is producing on schedule and that my daughter identified and resolved a land fraud attempt in her first 6 weeks of management, which is more than the previous arrangement accomplished in 4 years. I also told them that James Aldridge is a man I turned down 2 years ago and that I do not take business advice from men I have already said no to. The management agreement stands. Do the work. Send me numbers every month. Not every quarter. She read it once. She set it down. She did not cry, because she was not the kind of woman who cried at writing desks in front of open doors. But she sat very still for a moment with her hands flat on the table. And the feeling that moved through her was not triumph and not relief, but something older and quieter than either, the feeling of being known clearly by someone who had not always managed it, and of that knowing arriving exactly when it needed to. Porter was still in the doorway. "Good news? The agreement stands." She folded the letter. "Send Cooper in, please. We have work to do." She recognized the handwriting before she opened it and stood at the writing desk for a moment. Not from dread, but from the simple honesty of acknowledging that a chapter of her life was about to speak once more before it fully closed. He wrote, "Evelyn, I have heard through appropriate channels that the Colorado property is in active development. I am glad of it. Your father tells me the first quarter looks promising. I wanted to write and say without implication and without any expectation of response that I think you made the right choice. I don't mean about Colorado. I mean about everything. I thought I knew what I wanted. I am less certain now that I knew what you needed. Those are different things, and a man who can't tell the difference is not the man you deserved. I wish you well. I mean that exactly as it's written." C. Whitmore. She read it twice. She sat with it for a long time. Then she folded it carefully and placed it in the back of her notebook, not discarded, not displayed, filed honestly among the things that were real. She went out to find Everhart. He was at the paddock fence with Cooper, going over something that involved a sketch on a piece of paper and a considerable amount of disagreement, which was the most productive kind of conversation those two had. She stood at the fence beside them and listened for a moment before Cooper saw her and straightened. "Miss Hartwell, don't stop on my account." She leaned on the fence rail and looked at the sketch. "What are we arguing about?" "Water trough placement," Cooper said. "He wants them at the east side. I say south is better access for the expanded herd." She looked at the sketch. She looked at the paddock. She thought about it for exactly as long as it required. "South," she said, "but offset from the gate by 8 feet so the crowding doesn't create a bottleneck at turnout." Cooper looked at Everhart with the triumphant expression of someone who has just won a debate he did not expect to win. Everhart looked at her. The corner of his mouth moved. 8 feet, he said, making the note. "Should have asked you first." "Yes," she agreed pleasantly. "You should have." Cooper folded the sketch with elaborate casualness and headed toward the barn. And she and Everhart were left at the fence in the December air, which had the particular sharp quality of Colorado winter beginning to mean business. "A letter came," she said, "from Charles." He waited. "He said he thinks I made the right choice." A pause. "Do you?" She looked at the paddock, at the good ground, at the survey stakes visible in the distance, at the ranch that was becoming what her 12 pages had said it could be. "Every day," she said. He was quiet beside her. Then, "The well survey comes back next week." "I know. If we hit water at 40 feet, we celebrate. If we hit 60, we adjust." She turned to look at him. "Either way, we keep going." He looked back at her. "Either way." The well came in at 43 feet, which was close enough to 40 to feel like a grace note, not perfect. Not easy, but better than the worst possibility, and honest about the rest. Briggs certified it the week before Christmas, and Cooper ran back from the well site to the main house, shouting the number loud enough that Gus heard it from the barn and came out to see what the noise was about. Evelyn was at the writing desk when Cooper burst through the door, and she looked up at his face and knew the answer before he said it. 43, Miss Hartwell. 43 feet. She put down her pen. "Go get Porter. Porter already knows. He's crying a little. Then go tell him that's perfectly reasonable." She sat for a moment after Cooper left, in the quiet of the study, with the survey notes on one side and the management agreement's first quarterly report taking shape on the other. And she thought about 12 pages and a man who said the Fland deserved an honest account of itself. And she thought about 60 acres, named for 2 people who loved each other. And she thought about her mother saying women of our family have a talent for dawdling and calling it patience. She picked up her pen. She finished the quarterly report. Every honest word of it. That evening, all 5 of them, Porter and Cooper and Gus and Everhart and herself, sat at the supper table with better food than usual, because the cook's wife had apparently decided the well called for celebration, and the table was louder than it had ever been. And at one point, Cooper made a toast with his coffee cup that was so long and so earnest that Gus fell asleep midway through, and no one told him until it was over. She laughed. She laughed fully and without composure. And it had been long enough since she'd done that, without thinking about it first, that the freedom of it caught her off guard. She looked up and found Everhart watching her, not with the assessment she had first taken for indifference. Not with the careful restraint of a man keeping himself on the right side of an important line. With the open, uncomplicated attention of someone who is exactly where he intended to be. She held his gaze, he raised his coffee cup, she raised hers. No words needed. In the spring, the real spring. When the creek redirect was complete, and the first new herd was grazing the south pasture, and the water trough stood exactly 8 feet from the gate, and Cooper was leading with the quiet confidence of a young man who had been given the right job at the right time, Samuel Everhart asked her the important thing. He did not ask it dramatically. He was not that kind of man. He asked it at the fence line, the east fence, the one where they had first talked about the gravel bar. The one where she had told him that knowing something's worth matters, even when nothing changes because of it. He stood with his hat in his hand and looked at her steadily and said, "I've been saving for 3 years. Not enough for land of my own, but enough to invest alongside someone who knows what she's doing." He paused. "I'd like to do that. I'd like to build something here that has both our names on it. If you're willing." She looked at him. "That's a business proposition. It's also a question about the rest of my life." He held her gaze without any hesitation. "But I told you I wouldn't ask you anything that put your family position against a cowboy. So I'm asking you as a partner first. The rest is your decision." She thought about Charles saying, "I think I knew what I wanted, but not what you needed." She thought about her mother saying, "Don't dawdle." She thought about 12 pages and 43 feet and a name on a management agreement that she had put there herself with clear eyes. "My answer to both questions is yes," she said. He was quiet for one beat. "Both. Both." She held his gaze. "But I want my name on the deed. I wouldn't have it any other way. And the water rights stay in the Hartwell agreement." Agreed. "And Cooper gets a proper wage increase in August." Something moved through his expression that was trying very hard not to become the full smile. "And not quite succeeding. Are we negotiating a marriage or a land contract? A woman who can't see clearly in both shouldn't be trusted with either," she said. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said quietly and without any decoration at all, "Evelyn Hartwell, I have been certain about very few things in my life. You are one of them." She took a breath that was steadier than she expected. "Sam Everhart, you held a gate open for me once, I remember. I've been walking through it ever since." He reached out, and she took his hand, not the businesslike handshake of that October morning in Denver, but something else, something that meant what it meant, and did not need translation. They stood at the east fence in the spring air, with 60 acres of honest ground around them, and a creek running the way it was supposed to run, and a well at 43 feet, and a future they had both decided to enter with open eyes. Years later, when her niece came to visit and walk the property and ask the question that young people always ask, "Wasn't it frightening to give up everything you had?" Evelyn was quiet for a moment. They were standing at the east fence, same as always. Because some places hold the important things the way good ground holds water. "I didn't give anything up," she said. Her niece waited. "I gave back the life that was handed to me." She looked at the creek, running clean, and I went to find the one that was mine. The niece thought about this. "How did you know it was yours?" "Because I wrote 12 honest pages about it." She smiled. And every word was true. A promise made by others can become a prison with very comfortable furniture, easy to stay in. Because it was built by people who meant well and decorated with things that look like love. But a promise chosen with full knowledge of your own worth, chosen with clear eyes and a steady hand, and the willingness to write the honest thing, even when no one asks for it, that kind of promise does not become a prison. It becomes a home, and the woman who builds it gets to put her name on the deed.